remind me to turn the AC on. Hello and welcome to the live stream to discuss Bill Mollison's Attitudinal Principles of Permaculture. Even though I think that David's are by far the most well-known and most popular, I wanted to start with these because they're ones that you've likely heard before, but they're not something that we generally or regularly encounter within our discussions of permaculture. They always show up, but I don't find that they're something that is discussed as deeply or as fully. I will, however, be looking at David's Principles of Permaculture in more detail in the weeks ahead. Actually, the next live stream is going to be about David's Principles of Permaculture. I don't know how many we'll cover next time. I'm planning to start with the first 3, but it flows pretty well, and I've got my notes together. We may go ahead and cover all 6. As always, thank you for being here this evening, and if you're catching this in a replay, I'm glad to have you along for the journey. If you enjoy this, of course, pop over and join the Patreon community at patreon.com/permaculturepodcast, where you can get updates on what the next live streams are going to be, and also get involved in many of the conversations and help choose what the topics are going to be for these streams and for upcoming videos. So then, let's go ahead and dig into Bill Mollison's Attitudinal Principles a bit deeper. I don't know where these exactly come from. I personally first encountered them in Bill Mollison's Permaculture, a Designer's Manual, and I think that's where they're all collected. However, if you're hearing this and you know that they come from an earlier source, please go ahead and leave a comment in the show notes for this episode, or drop something into chat. In the case of how these are often talked about, we have 5 of them. They are: work with nature rather than against it, the problem is the solution, minimum effort for maximum effect, the yield of the system is theoretically unlimited, and everything gardens. Throughout this conversation tonight, when I'm talking about the various components that go into a permaculture design, I'm going to refer to those as elements, just to speak about them generically. When I use that term, I do mean that it could be any plants, insects, people, or anything else that is part of our design or the systems that we're bringing into fruition. Can also include pre-existing structures, homes, garden sheds, and even the tools and other items that we're using in implementing our design. But generally, I will be focusing more on like plants, animals, insects, and people this evening. So, the first of Mollison's principles that I want to touch on is work with nature rather than against it. And so, this is where a lot of our observation comes, and the idea of considering patterns within nature. How can we use those patterns in order to not only create our design, but also minimize the amount of work that we have to do? How can we continue to encourage flows or make use of them? A common one that comes to mind for me is that, water flows downhill. And so if we're looking for a place to place water in a system, it's better to do that high up, whether that means that we're building some kind of a pond or dam high in our landscape, or if we're simply catching water as it runs off of our roof directly into tanks in that location, and then placing our garden beds and our plants, if we can, downhill from them. And that may just be because of locations we're able to use hills, or perhaps even, building elevated platforms that our water tanks can rest on so that we can gather them higher in the landscape. And then, continuing to encourage flows or make use of them. So if we have a stream on a landscape, making sure that we take advantage of that. But a little bit more abstract from something like that is if there are certain paths that we walk down regularly within our system as part of our design, how can we encourage our use of a space by designing around those paths that we use regularly? And so, if we're going to be carrying compost out, what about placing our compost bin in a location so that we pass through our garden and might be able to spread some of that compost in the garden on our way? Or, putting our tool shed near the entrance to our garden. Or, maybe on a porch so that everything is available just as we walk out the door. And so looking for those patterns and the processes that we regularly engage in order to make the most use of them. Similarly, I've been speaking quite a bit on these live streams about children and permaculture. So what is the nature of the children that we're working with? When I think about my own two children, my son is much more physical and dynamic and tends to move around quite a bit. My daughter is a bit more introverted and in her own headspace and a bit more artistic in some ways than her brother. So when I think about the nature of children in that regard, what do they like to do? How can we engage what they're already involved in order to get them involved in our design and in our permaculture processes, and to encourage what it is that they are already engaged in our permaculture practices. And it's part of my ongoing interest as a permaculture educator. And like when I work with people one-on-one through mentoring or the storytelling for personal transformation class, a lot of what I do is about engaging in the strengths that we already have and turning our energy towards those strengths and what it is that we do so that we can increase the effect of our work. And that's what I think about when it comes to children in our processes, is working with who they are rather than trying to change them or get them to conform to something in particular, but instead, working with them, to use a parlance that we often reference in permaculture, to meet children where they're at and who they are and what it is they care about. And in doing so, how can we use our understanding of children and the resources of our design site to provide children with a space to grow and create? And I keep turning back to this because as a parent and an educator, a lot of times I work in spaces with children. When presenting at a nature festival or something like that, very often it is children who are coming up and wanting to get their hands in a worm bin or to get dirty and muddy with me. But also these ideas apply to adults as well. And I think about, trying to find the nature of a person. And as an educator, the idea of education is to draw out from someone that which they already are. So how can we do that as permaculture instructors as well, working with adults? Because nature is not just the nature that we encounter around us every day and just the plants and animals, but also the aspects of them as well. Thinking about the needs and yields assessment, just as we can do those with plants, animals, or anything that we want to include in a permaculture system, that we should be thinking about people as well when we work around particularly that idea of zone 0 and zone 00, our home and our household, or ourselves and the people who are within a system. Moving from working with nature rather than against it, the next one from Bill Mollison is the problem is the solution. And so, that's where I think about our zone and sector analysis so that we can know about what problems may already exist in a system or are likely to arise. By doing our assessment and putting those details down on paper somewhere, we can analyze them, develop an understanding of what's there, and develop solutions. But in looking at our problems, what are unique potential positives for those issues? And then in looking at those positives, how can we use them to our advantage? And so it could be something as, catastrophic as the amount of water that flows through a site and having to deal with flooding. Well, thinking about then the inundation of that water and being able to create systems that allow us to capture more of that, to slow it, spread it, and sink it into the ground, to build soil in order to take advantage of that, planting plants that will not be destroyed by the flood in that path, that then becomes something that we can make use of and be able to harvest for our needs as permaculture practitioners, designers, or just people in our community. Really looking for ways that we can use whatever it is in our system to our advantage. I think about some of the signs that I've seen at beaches where restaurants or bars or taverns will put a plastic bucket out with a sign, bring back a bucket of waste from the beach, and we'll give you, a free pint of something to drink or a free appetizer when you sit down for dinner. That's a great way of making a space that is being used and a problem of trash and turning it into a solution, not only for the restaurant by getting people to come and be a customer there, but also then to clean up some of this trash. And it becomes this, useful, reciprocal kind of relationship. And I like to look for that in anything that it is that we do. And so as permaculture practitioners, instructors, being able to look for ways that we can provide the means for people to engage with permaculture practices. It's one of the things for me as the host of the show, making sure that the podcast and these live streams and things are readily available to connect people with this information so that they can, be able to learn as much as they can as freely as possible so that money isn't a hindrance for folks. And then, looking for solutions for how to support these kinds of things, making things accessible for and readily available for people to support as they would like to. And so, with anything that we have in our system, there are lots of ways that we can work with it to design around problems. I mentioned the people on the beach with the buckets, because a lot of times it's going to be people walking through a site, especially if you're urban or suburban. And so, including some signage so that the space that we're working on becomes educational, looking for programs that we can participate in, such as, creating certified habitat for pollinators and things like that, which then gets more community buy-in, which creates a better educational space then as we put up those signs and draw interest. But also can be useful for avoiding spraying on a yard. As permaculture practitioners, a lot of what we do and design around is not necessarily what people would consider, a classic garden or super pretty or things like that. And so, getting those kinds of certifications can turn these spaces that are functional habitats into places that are respected by our political system. And I don't want to say get around or skirt or avoid, but it can limit the impact of things like weed ordinances if what we're doing looks a little scruffy. But sometimes just putting up signs and saying, hey, we're supporting the bees and the butterflies without that certification allows us to develop something that is deeply functional from a permaculture perspective while including the community with us. It's the same thing, like also getting involved politically is a great way to turn political problems into solutions as we educate people around us. And limit, again, those negative impacts that come in on what it is that we're doing. To pull it back around to children in a system, how can we create space for children to look at the problems around us? How can we include the novelty of the world that we live in and what it is that they're experiencing in order to hear from them and what they think could be useful or productive in our system? I think of all the, I don't want to say weird, but just the way that my children have looked at the world with eyes that are not my own, and how they have been able to show me the world in a different way. And so providing space just to invite children in to whatever it is that we're working on, make them a part of the process, and, get them engaged in creative problem solving. Oh, hey, 1, 2, thanks for joining us tonight and for your support on Patreon. Yeah, after now over a decade and a half of doing this work, I'm glad to still be here and continuing to look at different ways that we can do this. Really enjoying these live streams as ways to sit and be able to talk with folks. So feel free, if anything comes up or comes to mind, drop it in the chat and I'll address it as I can get to it. Um, you know, and of course, there's always the opportunity for a Q&A session as I wrap things up. I always like to provide that possibility as well. The next of Bill Mollison's 5 principles that usually get passed around is minimum effort for maximum effect. We also hear this as the smallest change for the most, for the, yes, the smallest change for the most out, the smallest change for the biggest outcome in a lot of different ways. But generally, what are little ways that we can tweak what it is that we're doing to create, bigger changes. And that can be something as simple as adding a few more plants to our garden, working with the idea of the food forest model and all of those different layers in order to look at how we can include more into our system. I think about all the different ways of engaging in agriculture around the world and how we can find techniques then for maximizing our yield, which I'll get to here in a minute with the next principle. But how can we work with nature and let nature do the work instead of us? Thinking about things like, as I mentioned earlier, for the work with nature rather than against it, this kind of reinforces that. And so, water runs downhill, as I mentioned earlier. How can we use that to get water where we need to? I often joke about swales of the darkness that haunt my soul, but I've seen implementation of swales in hugelkultur that makes sense. And not only do they slow water running down the hill, but if you're in a forested location where there are leaves and other material that can collect, just putting up some, digging in some swales, terracing, things like that are ways that we can collect those resources. And once we put those systems in place, they last for years and years. Looking at the potential for energy decline and the increase for the cost of energy for our use of mechanization. How can we work without using fossil fuels because of understanding just how much energy is inherent in a gallon of gasoline and how much energy we're using to bring that into a system, and making the best choices we can about the resources that we are going to use. I know a number of permaculture farms that do use small walk-behind tractors because that's the solution that allows them to be as productive as they want to be and provide for not only their own family, but I think of Radical Roots here in Western Virginia. And, it's not only Lee and Dave O'Neill and their family, but they bring on a large number of interns who they're training year after year. And so they're able to do a lot more with that one piece of equipment. Just being able to make those decisions that are right for us. I think back to Ethan Hughes, and it's one of the things that I've always loved about permaculture is that, generally speaking, it is not judgmental and, trying to prescribe solutions, but rather helping people develop the tools that they need in order to make the best decision for the situation that they're in. I think about my own life, and I live in a location where I don't have ready access to green space. So my ability to grow is fairly limited. But because the community that I am in is walkable, my wife and I function with only one car and are able to do quite a bit because of that. And, by making some of the decisions we did to live where we are, having access to some public transportation, including the metro system, which connects Northern Virginia and other locales, while also just choosing to live in a location that happens to put us near a farmer's market and grocery stores and things like that, reduces our need for fossil fuel use, while also understanding that that means that I can't grow as much food as I would like to. I don't have close access to a community garden. And so, again, I think about appropriate location and the zone model, and that in many cases we're better off having a small amount of ground close to us. That's better than a large amount further away. And, I have some friends in the community who do own property that is, an hour or two away from where they regularly work and live. And so they're engaging in processes that allow them to do some deep work, but they're not able to visit it regularly. And that's something they talk about. But I think that that's one of the things that we need to think about, especially if we're looking for land to live and grow on, and be having these conversations about what works best for us. It took a lot of time for me to grow or to try growing things to realize that I'm not the best gardener. And so, these are the spaces that I enjoy engaging in most. And, through your feedback and everything else, I know that I've reached hundreds of thousands of people. And from direct feedback, that it's helped a lot of folks move their lives. And so, again, using those strengths. Because, again, the minimum effort for maximum yield comes from using the resources we already have. And that includes our own resources and our own energy. And so engaging in the activities that we most enjoy and care about, because that's how we're going to make the biggest difference. Just time and time again, over and over again, doing what we love and are good at is where we will see the most effect. It's not to say, again, because I love to teach and I think that all of us should be engaged in our education and learning as much as we can and really building and growing what it is that we do. If there's something that you feel really moved by, then please, engage in it and do what you want to do. But try to find ways that those things that we do align with our best efforts. Also, with this idea of minimum effort for maximum effect, I try, again, to think about how to use and reuse resources. And, that idea of refusing to bring things into our lives unless we absolutely have to, being able to repair them. It's why when it comes to certain tools, I really prefer like trimmers and things that are not riveted together but have a screw that I can remove to pull it apart, because not only is it generally easier for me to repair that because I don't have to drill it out, but it makes maintenance easier if I want to pull it apart. I like tools with wooden handles because those are things that I can shape with minimum additional tools. If I really wanted to, with the right set of stones and a couple of good knives, I can carve a lot of different tool handles. Screws and pins and things, to hold handles on rather than rivets, because I don't have the riveting tools, and like being able to do those kinds of repairs within my system. I think about tarps as something that I bring within my system a lot, and because I like tarps a lot because they're inexpensive and I can use them to solarize in order to remove weeds and prepare beds. I can use them as ground covers. If I want to, I can use them as shade. Tarps are great in order to create a covering if I want to create a quick outdoor class space without necessarily needing a large tent, a couple of large tarps, and some guy lines and things, especially if there are trees in the area. Quick and easy way to put together an outdoor space. And it's where I think a lot about when we want to create minimal effort in our work to create the maximum effect. It's one of the reasons why reskilling is really important within permaculture, and developing the skill set that matters to us and engaging the things that we want to do, while also recognizing that a minimum effort, there's an idea that I've run across from being in information technology and working with computers and things for so long, fast, cheap, or easy. And, pick two. If you want it fast and cheap, it's not going to be easy. If you want it cheap and easy, it's not going to be fast. And so a lot of times within permaculture, I think about taking the slow road. and develop your skills over time, develop your equipment that you're going to use over time. We talk very often about needing to spend time to get to know a site, and that's something that can take really honestly years. And it's where, like, as we look at climate change and crisis acceleration and things like that, yes, there is a particular urgency, but if we try to move too quickly, it's going to take a lot of effort by everyone. And so trying to find a good balance there, and taking this time again as practitioners to develop our knowledge and develop our skill set, and be able to go and have good meaningful conversations with people about these pieces that we care about. Yeah, and it's also like with wanting to include children in our processes, that again, how can we expose them over and over again to what it is that we're doing? Because I really think, especially with younger children, exposure is the best way for us to do this with minimal effort. Just make them a part of what we do, and they'll be along with us throughout the process. The next principle from Bill Mollison is the yield of the system is theoretically unlimited. And I've got some basic graphics I'll share here with you in a moment. I mentioned this last time in the last live stream, holding up some fingers and talking about connections and things. Made some graphics for this one. And what I think about this idea of the yield of the system is theoretically unlimited is that we need to look at yields beyond just human use and what every element within a system contributes to our design. And so when I think about what I'm going to be bringing in, I'll pull up a graphic that we had last time. There's this image of the permaculture chicken that is super, you've probably seen dozens and dozens of time in your permaculture work. But it's that, the products that come from a chicken are more than just one item. They produce eggs, they produce meat, they produce feathers, manure, methane, CO2. We talked last time about how we can use chickens, in a garden in order to help eliminate insects. Their scratching helps us prepare beds. What the chicken adds to our system is more than just a single thing. So it's doing that needs and yields assessment to understand what every element in our system gives back. And so we get tons and tons of resources that a single element can provide. And so not only is it everything that a given element can provide, it's also then the connections that are created within our system from those elements. And so let's see how this works. So, if we're looking at one-to-one connections by elements in our system, which, as I illustrate with the chicken, isn't actually the case, every element provides more than one yield or connection. If we have one element and it connects back to itself, we get one connection. If we have two elements in a system and they're interconnected, we have three connections as they link back to themselves and each other. If we add a third item, it becomes six. And you can see now that this is, starting to explode. And then it gets even more as we add four elements, it jumps, four more from 6 to 10. And so there's actually a formula for this. Let me move myself real quick. Whoop. Let me see if I can. If you want to learn more about how these connections can explode and this massive growth, I recommend looking into mesh topology or mesh networking. Can give you a lot of information about the way elements can connect to each other and everything else. But as I show here, the formula for the number of connections between elements here at the top is this n times n minus 1 divided by 2 plus n represent those singular connections. And you can see here how it explodes. We go from those 4 elements having 10 connections to, with this formula, that 5 becomes 15, 6 becomes 21. Then 10 more than doubles the number of connections from 6, 15 more than doubles the number from 10, and it just continues to grow and grow and grow very rapidly. And then when we bring this back to the chicken and think about all the different yields within a system and the way that they relate to the human, the other than human, the way that a tree provides, its leaf litter, which can become fertilization for the plants underneath, or if we're talking about conifers, that their needles can help it to acidify soil. That's a different use. Plus we have the shade, plus we can look at like the ephemerals that can grow under a particular tree that will emerge under them during spring in temperate climates. And just these yields just keep growing and growing and growing the more that we look at those connections. And so, when we think about this, it's how can we create more yields from the same activity or system? And so that's where I go back to thinking about minimum effort for maximum effect, to work with nature rather than against it, for how the problem is the solution. And as we start bringing all of those different pieces together, the yields just really rapidly explode. And it's where, like, as a longtime permaculture practitioner and designer, where I think it's important for us, as we do like our needs and yields assessment and look at all of these elements, it gives us a better idea of how we can also consider the ways that we can design ourselves out of the system, or make it self-sustaining by creating all of those different connections. And the way that what we're doing builds more, even though I feel that we should be designing primarily for human use. I think back to what Bob Tice, the architect Bob Tice, said when I was exploring natural building with him, that, there are beautiful pieces of land that don't need us. And so working on creating all of these connections, we can not only meet human needs, but also create a system that flourishes long after we as designers are gone. And then, continuing this idea of children in our design process, what thoughts do they include when they think about yields from a system? And, aesthetics can be an amazing yield. And, the educational space that we provide for children and others when we create these things, and being able to talk about the variety of colors from something as simple as tomatoes, or all the flowers that we're growing. And yeah, just asking children, what do they think about what we're designing and what the yields are, and getting them included in the conversation. And so the final principle from Bill Mollison is that everything gardens. And when I first thought of this idea and had it introduced to me, a lot of the conversation kind of revolved around the idea of, the waste of one element is often the nutrient for another. Or, we think of, like in the United States, the Three Sisters garden, and how we can use corn to support beans, and squash then, and then the beans can help fix nitrogen for squash, which are heavy feeders, and then the squash covers the soil. And we kind of look at the way that those elements are connected and support one another. But then when I started digging into this later on in my permaculture journey, was thinking about all the ways that elements impact what's around them. And so thinking about how does an element of our system change its surroundings. And even though we might think of something like a rock as inanimate, that, it can provide habitat for our microfauna and some smaller creatures depending on its shape and how it sits on the ground. It can break up rainfall and cause that rain to, run to the edges of the rock, and then create a space where there is more water in our system, and create a microclimate. That rock can, depending on its location, catch the sun early and create a space that remains warmer later in the evening during cooler times. During the summer months, that rock can also carry some of the coolness from the evening into the day, because of the way that its temperature can help regulate. And, looking at all the ways that just that one rock and an inanimate element of our system can change the other elements around it. When I think of looking for microclimates, one of my favorite places to look in the built environment are walls, because of their location, their shape. Very often they can have a green space behind them or in front of them or around them, and using those to look for microclimates. And, or using those spaces for something, a technique like a spalier. And so, the way that we can make use of these elements, again, going back to that idea of the least change for the maximum effect, working with what we have rather than against it, looking for things that we might see as problems and turning them into solutions. How do the elements that are in our system help others? As I mentioned, the Three Sisters Garden here in the temperate East, and the way that those vertical stalks provide support for the beans and the cover and the squash providing cover for the ground and so on. But also it's thinking about how do elements improve their surroundings. I think about, our birds that eat fruits and spread their seeds, the way that different animals interact, our ability as practitioners to choose what it is we might plant in our gardens when we're looking to tend zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3. And we can choose varieties that will self-seed. Well, then they have an impact on the environment and they can change it as well. And so thinking about all those different ways that what we include change the world around them. And the ways in which every element in some ways tend the garden that we're designing. I grew up in a Christian church, and, I think about the bounty of what it is that we're creating as permaculture practitioners, and thinking about Bill Mollison's principle that everything gardens, and the way that we can create beautiful spaces, and think back to this idea of like Eden, and the way that we can, see something like that manifest by being aware of all the ways that everything in our system interacts, and how we can have a bounty without needing to be the ones who are constantly creating or trying to recreate it. That by being a part of the world and being an active participant in the systems we create, that we grow and shape them. And so does everything else that we want to bring in. And by having a knowledge of it, we can deepen the benefits that come from the decisions that we make. So, yeah. And I love being an active participant in the community around me, both the people and the plants and everything else. And the more that we interact as practitioners, the more that we deepen our connections, and so that we benefit from the yields that are around us. But on this last particular principle, when I think about children and including them in our permaculture practices, how can they contribute to what it is that we're creating? How can their contributions be included in our activities? Whether that's having them help us plant seeds and be part of the garden, or, how can we create opportunities for them to spend time in nature, to make observations, and then through that time spent to improve their understanding of the world and create educational spaces. Can we provide spontaneous opportunities for this kind of education, depending on the day and where we find ourselves, when it starts to rain, to take them outside and walk around and look for the patterns and look for the flows within the natural world, to see what emerges when it's wet, when it's dry, what blows into the spaces that we call home when it's windy. And then, how can we work with children to make sure that their influence is positive and that they get a beneficial yield from everything that it is that we're doing? From having nutritious food to a warm, comfortable, safe place to explore, not only as parents and guardians, but also as teachers and members of our community. And, how being a part of this great collective of humanity. And yeah, doing as much as we can to, as we grow older, give back to those who are coming up behind us, and be able to take responsibility for our lives and those who are the descendants of our generation, whether they are our children or not. Yeah, I think about the world ahead, and I don't know what it's going to look like. In my 40 some years, it's been quite a journey. I remember an analog childhood that then quickly became digital while I was in my single digits, having my first computer and popping onto networks and sharing information at a young age, and then being actively involved in technology for so long and just watching how rapidly that's changed and how our climate has changed, how world politics have changed, and I have no idea what's going to exist for my children or the generations that come after them, but I'd like to be able to leave them the skills necessary to be able to navigate that. I'd like to be able to provide them with the knowledge and opportunity to be able to create the world that they want to live in, while also myself wanting to make sure that, I individually and the permaculture community as a whole create a legacy of bounty and joy for, everyone who we may never meet in the world as it is now, as well as for those who will follow us. Because as I'm reminded by many of my friends who are involved in looking at what the world could be like after the fall of civilization and what could come in a decade or a generation or a century, that regardless of what happens, humanity is likely to survive. Civilization may not, or what we think of as, current polities and things like that. But humanity is likely to survive for hundreds and thousands of years, even looking at some of the worst case scenarios for climate change. So what can we do right now to provide for a beautiful, productive future, whatever that is? So I think that's kind of like my goal as a permaculture practitioner, as the host of the show, as, your friend for all these years, is us being able to work together to create the most beautiful world possible right now and for future generations. But that covers, a look at Bill Mollison's attitudinal principles. I hope that was helpful for those of you who are watching this live. If you have any questions that you'd like to drop in the chat about what we talked about tonight, or about anything else that just comes to mind as we're here together and have some time left, if you'd like to drop those in chat, I'll address those now. Take a drink here, give you an opportunity for that, talk about the next live stream for a second, and then, we'll bring this to a close. All right. From here, the next live stream is going to continue this conversation about the principles of permaculture and include the ways that, we can be more inclusive of children in these conversations and the application of permaculture, while just diving deep into those principles. Ideally, right now, I'm looking at the... Let me pull my calendar up. Next time I was going to start with David Holmgren's first three permaculture principles: observe and interact, catch and store energy, and obtain a yield, as they build really well in what we talked about this evening. I'm trying to align some conversations with some colleagues who are in vastly different time zones for me, which means I'm going to need to talk with them in the evening, so there will not be a live stream on Wednesday, July 7th. Also, no live stream this coming weekend, the July 3rd or 4th, as my children will be down for a long weekend, so we're all going to be hanging out. The next live stream, therefore, will be should be Sunday, July 11th. I'm going to do one earlier in the afternoon and run for a while. Include some time for Q&A, get the word out. Hopefully we'll have a nice little collection of folks to sit down and chat together. I'm planning, though, to have most of my notes for all 12 of David's permaculture principles together, so that if we do just kind of dive in and it goes well, to continue the conversation as long as it goes. If it's, half an hour and we get through 3 and that's where we're at, then that's what we do. If we go ahead and cover all 12 and we're here for a couple of hours doing Q&A and everything else, then that's cool too. Kind of have that afternoon open. And just looking forward to kind of digging into this. I really am enjoying getting a chance to talk with you about some of these fundamental ideas of permaculture, because it's having done this now for 11 years, it's helpful for me to revisit these ideas too and do a bit of a refresher and get into the conversation and kind of see where my thoughts are after all this time and how they've changed, because, all of this information continues to grow over time. And so does the ideas within the community. They continue to grow and evolve as well. So yeah, and then from there, I should, for Patreon supporters, on Tuesday the 6th, I'll have my next weekly update out for you guys, and then I should have some more of the live streams mapped out for when those will be and what the topics will be. Looking to do some midday live streams during the week to try to help reach folks elsewhere in the world, particularly Australia's 14 hours ahead and things like that. So, it's early in the morning there, so I may have to do something late in the middle of the night too, but just to spread these around. If you want to get in touch with me, feel free to text me. 717-827-6266 is the podcast main number. You can text me there. It's probably the best way to get a hold of me if you want something quick. Of course, you can email me if you've got something bigger, show@thepermaculturepodcast.com. If you want to book a consultation on Reandering to dig in deep on something that you're working on, you'll find tons of information about those and how to schedule something at thepermaculturepodcast.com. Links in the top bar for meanderings and consultations. You'll find me on Twitter at permaculturepod. It's where I tend to do most of my social media these days. I am on Instagram, but tend to post a little less there than I probably should, but there I'm at Permaculture Podcast if you want to get in touch. And yeah, of course, Patreon. I'm on there regularly throughout the week. Patreon supporters also get access to the Discord for us to have some conversations. And of course, that's at patreon.com/permaculturepodcast. And that covers everything. If you're new to the channel and you got directed here, feel free to like this video, subscribe, click the bell so you get notifications when new ones of these come out. I plan to try to use some of the community features on YouTube to give more announcements about this stuff before it goes live. Still kind of learning how to navigate this system. But yeah, if there's any places or ideas that you have that you'd like me to dig into, just get in touch, and I'm more than happy to cover them on a future live stream, an episode of the podcast. I will have some singular long format episodes of the show coming out in July and August before the seasonal relaunch in September, looking at urban permaculture and urban agriculture, which is more of a developed idea where I'll do an intro episode kind of talking, that'll just be me talking about what'll be covered, some of the voices that you'll be hearing, and then probably around 4 episodes digging into just some ideas around urban permaculture and urban agriculture, to talk about what some of those particular challenges are and what people are facing in those spaces, including land access and getting started. And yeah, just kind of trying to mix some different voices and thoughts together, try something different, see how that goes, what the response is. After that, I think the season after that is going to be on radical self-care. Looking at not only what are the things that we can do physically. There's some folks I want to talk to, like the author of Born to Run, about what it means to just move. Katie Bowman and a lot of her work on movement, I think, is super important. So talking with her as well, got a couple of her books to review as part of that process, and having Jesse Bloom back on the show to talk about her work when it comes to like just emotional and spiritual care, because those things are super important as well. And just kind of we'll dig into some of those thoughts and what all that means. And I can share with you some of the processes that I've used over the years to take care of myself. I imagine that's going to be like super candid and interesting to get into, because there's some vulnerability required, I think, to have conversations about what it means to actually take care of ourselves beyond, for me, self-care and the idea of radical self-care is more than just taking a vacation, but about building the things that we need to live a meaningful, productive life into everything that we do, and being able to dig deeply into what our limitations are, and work within those to create a life that is beautiful, that we love. And for me, that's what self-care really is about. And I think that there's a need to have the conversation on that level. And there's of course the need for some of those short-term things, like taking some downtime and things like that. But what does it look like to really take care of ourselves? And it's something that I've had to work on over the years, and I'm really looking forward to. But I'm also this series on urban permaculture and urban agriculture is really interesting for me, because just some of the conversations and readings that I've done so far show what a lot of those limitations are as well, especially as land becomes more expensive, and what are ways that we can gain access to land. And I've also, had a lot of pushback over the years that if I'm not, this is pushback that I personally have received, is that if I'm not on some kind of meaningful acreage, then what it is that I'm doing doesn't count as permaculture. And frankly, I think that that's crap, because permaculture, Bill Mollison in the designer's manual, there's chapter 14, which lists all these other things that just, I think that he never got around to because of how much the permaculture design course kind of exploded, and he was teaching it for so many years. And, now in the last kind of wave of permaculture, we're talking about community scale permaculture. Luby McNamara wrote, I've got it somewhere on my shelf, but it's, her book on people in permaculture really started this conversation about social permaculture. And I think that's super important. And so is being politically involved. And so those are some of the conversations that I think we're also going to get into when it comes to urban permaculture and urban agriculture, is just the need to look at permaculture more broadly than just having a garden. And so that's where also this diving into the principles of permaculture, I think, is really big too, because we need to talk about the ways that these apply beyond the landscape. So that's kind of where I'm at and where we'll be in the months ahead. David Bilbrey has a couple of interviews that he's recorded that I'll be working on editing and releasing. I've got 2 interviews with David Holmgren that my friend Dan Palmer recorded as part of his work on exploring the permaculture design process and the idea of making permaculture stronger. And there's also a project that I'm working on that's happening behind the scenes that I can't share yet, but hopefully I'll be able to say for certain during the next live stream what that is. But it's really exciting, and if we're able to come to some agreements on how to get that together, it's something I'm super excited about and looking forward to sharing with you. But I'm going to have to keep that private until we've got some more things agreed to and stuff in the works. But thank you all for joining me this evening. I'll pop up the ending screen here with some information about the next live stream, and I will catch you all again soon. So thank you for joining me, and have a great night or day, however you found this. And we'll do one of these again here on July 11th. Take care.